Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Bruges Group meeting. We've got three members of Parliament here who are not only distinguished, I should have said three parliamentarians, indeed, yes. Three outstanding parliamentarians. They're not only very effective parliamentarians, but they're also people that have been very successful outside their political and parliamentary environment. And it's a great pleasure to have people here speaking that have quite a wide range of experience. First of all, I would like to introduce Graham Stringer, who is the Member of Parliament for Blackley and Broughton, and has been a Member of Parliament since 1997. Before that, he had a real job as an analytical chemist, and was also leader of Manchester City Council, a task which I think he did for some 13 years, which is quite an achievement, as those of us that have had any involvement with local government will fully understand. I think Graham is also the first person to recommend that Alex Ferguson should go to the House of Lords. Sir Alex, for some reason, was not minded to take his advice. But I don't know if Graham will tell us tonight what future career plans he might think are appropriate for David Moyes. Graham is a member of the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee. In 2010, he was the only member of the Science and Technology Select Committee with a scientific background. And he participated in the inquiry into the climatic research email controversy, which some of you may be familiar with. Indeed, he voted against the other members of the panel on every vote, representing a formulation more critical of the CRU and climate change scientists. Ladies and gentlemen, Graham Stringer.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I want to do three things really. One, talk a little bit about the science of climate change, a little bit about the emails at the University of East Anglia and the IPCC's latest report, as we're looking at it on the Energy and Climate Change Committee, and a little bit about energy policy itself in the United Kingdom and Europe, and try to round that up with what I think is an underlying theme between those of us who are sceptical about the remedies to climate change and those of us who are sceptical about the European Union. I hope that's not too large a task in 15 or something minutes, but I will try. One thing I will say before I get into the University of East Anglia is during the debate on climate change and the emails, one of the things that has occurred to me as a scientist at one level I knew and understood this, but at another level it's only when you're involved in a debate that you recognise the importance of it. And that is the difference between politics and science. Politics is adversarial, where you want to convince people of your point of view, and you exaggerate sometimes your arguments, you diminish the weak points of your arguments. Whereas science is really about trying to get to the truth of an argument. Sometimes it's demolishing a thesis, and the best scientists, of course, if their thesis is destroyed, are grateful and welcome it, because it is advanced knowledge, and that is a real difference. And when people try to use science in a political sphere and vice versa, we get terrible confusion. when I were to get to the University of East Anglia, because I think it highlights some really quite important points. It's now 4.5 years ago since the emails were released, and 3.5 years ago since the second set of emails were released. And depending on how you count them, I think Andrew Montfort, who's written an excellent book about the inquiries into the University of East Anglia emails, ClimateGate, would call it 5. In one real sense, it was 3 inquiries. There was one by the Science and Technology Committee, one by Lord Oxborough, and one by Muir Russell. Now, the press at the time was looking for people to say in those inquiries 2 things. Professor Jones from the University of East Anglia is a scoundrel and a cheat, and climate change doesn't exist. And actually, if that wasn't said, then there was no story as far as much of the press was concerned. Actually, if you read the reports, which were neither a whitewash nor did they deliver that expectation of the press, they tell a pretty devastating story. Oxborough and Professor Kelly from Cambridge, who was a member of the Oxborough panel, pointed out that Jones was using poor statistical techniques, poor codes for the computer analysis, and Professor Kelly, who is a professor of engineering at Cambridge, used phrases in a report which wasn't part of the report, but was reported to the Science and Technology Committee, such as "this is turning centuries of science on its head." It was impossible to distinguish between what Jones was doing and cherry-picking results. And most devastatingly of all, that Jones could not produce his work. He not only stopped those people who wanted to look at the work, looking at the work itself, but he could not produce the work itself. Now, science progresses by challenging the work, by repeating experiments to validate them or invalidate them, and that was simply not possible. Jones could not do that itself. And one of the things I said in the debates about it is that isn't science, that is writing a narrative. And I think when you combine that with the fact that the Muir-Russell report failed to ask the central question, which was, were the emails deleted by Jones or not, to obscure the information getting out, he gave a very Sir Humphrey answer to it and said that it was too legalistic. The only person who ever asked Jones whether he deleted those emails was his own boss, the Vice-Chancellor at the university, whose job it was to protect Jones. So we had emails that indicated that there was a subversion of peer review, that there was skullduggery really going on. That's what the emails indicated, and the inquiries really got nowhere in dealing with the central issue, but they did expose the fact that real science wasn't taking place there. The conclusion I've come to is not only that it wasn't science, it was narrative that was being reported, but it was a classic case of noble cause corruption that was taking place. People believe they're saving the planet with the science that they're doing, and push the results towards that way. Both the University of East Anglia, who hold one of the 3 major temperature records of the planet, are really important to the story of climate change and scepticism about it, as is the IPCC, because the whole of our energy policy in this country and the European Union's energy policy is predicated on the fact that catastrophic climate change is happening. We've just had the 5th assessment report of the IPCC, and it's interesting in looking at it in detail how it has been produced. The Energy and Climate Change Committee is looking at this the present time, and what is being said and what criticisms we can make of it. The first assessment report, which is on the science, as opposed to the potential consequences and remedies of what's going on, takes 3,000 or so papers and reduces it to 31 pages of summary. That summary is produced by governments talking to the scientists. It is a political process at the end of the day that produces that debate. There are no minority reports, and there is bound to, if you are distilling such complex subjects down to 31 pages, there are bound to be disagreements and disputes about it. So that is the process. It's far from satisfactory, and one would expect minority reports. What else has become clear, mainly from Peter Lilly's questioning at the Energy and Climate Change report, is that the models of climate change are diverging very quickly from the observations that are being made about what is happening to the climate. So there is no real consensus. Many of the headlines that have come out about the report are inaccurate when you look at the detail of what is happening. It is the impact of that and what the remedies should be that where the real debate is. And that debate is wide and varied. So I had a big row with the Minister of State of the Energy and Climate Change Committee when I pointed out to him that while he talked about consensus, that was a consensus, but actually a survey of the American Meteorological Society found that about 52% of them did not believe in catastrophic global warming caused by carbon dioxide. What I want to talk about now is our energy policy and what it means. We're in the middle of an election to the European Union. There will be an election in just over 12 months' time to the House of Commons. You can almost guarantee that no political party will say, what we want to do is increase the price of your energy as quickly as possible. We want to industrialise the countryside, and we want to stop the third world getting richer. But in practice, that is what our energy policy means. It was interesting this morning that Ed Davey was on the Today programme on Radio 4, talking about part of it. He got very soft questioning. He was talking about £12 billion worth of investment in wind farms and other alternative forms of energy. He didn't say that a large part of that investment meant or means that energy will be produced at 3 times the current cost of energy being produced. So if oil is at $135, $140 a barrel at the present time, multiply it by 3, which is the cost of energy coming from offshore wind. He talked about putting the price of energy up by a mere 2% by 2020, and eventually it would be cheaper doing that. But of course, the other leg of the energy policy, it is not just a belief in catastrophic global warming, of which the evidence is pretty thin, that there is going to be a catastrophe. It is based on the fact that oil will become extremely expensive, that there will be peak oil. In fact, we've just passed peak oil, so it will go on getting expensive. So you might be producing energy at 3 times the cost now, but you will be very lucky in 5, 6 years' time, and all these people who are still dependent on fossil fuels are paying more for it. Well, David doesn't seem to have noticed, or if he has, he isn't really letting on, that the world has changed since this policy started. That in North America, shale gas has been decoupled from the price of oil, that energy costs in North America are much lower than in Europe, and that we are going to be paying more for energy while they are paying less. He also doesn't seem to have realised that, because the other argument, if you say that there is no reason for doing this, then we're told that we're giving a lead to the rest of the world. Well, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but I don't believe the 1.2 billion people in China are looking to Ed David to say that they will stop building 3 coal plants, 3 coal plants a week, because they want to enjoy the same wealth that we have enjoyed in the West for the same time. Similar things can apply to India and would apply in Africa and elsewhere in the Third World if the aid that we were giving them by the European Investment Bank and the World Bank and various other aid agencies didn't insist on keeping them poor. I mean, it is an extraordinary story, the attachments we put to aid when we're supposed to be helping countries in order to keep them poor. Nigeria is a classic example. Oil rich, many of the people can't get access to that energy, and helping them get access to that energy in what is a corrupt society, admittedly, should be the target of any aid programs in Nigeria. What do? We put millions of pounds into energy efficiency when most of the population haven't got energy. In Pakistan, which have deposits of coal and natural gas, we won't help them exploit that, so they're destroying forests right across Pakistan and are remaining poor and energy free, without any energy a lot of the time. One can go on and on giving examples like that. There's one final point about the folly of our energy policy, which isn't often pointed out. I think some of the things I've said are regularly pointed out. But if you follow through the logic of our energy policy, which is to electrify it, and so that there is 80% from renewables and electricity at some fairly near time in the future, that means that you will have no choice to have gas. You will eventually have to switch off the gas supply. You will not find that in any party manifesto, but the actual consequence of our current policy is that you will not be supplied with gas to your homes. This is not just a British problem, a British policy. It comes directly from the wonderfully 2020-20 EU policy. 20% renewables by 20% by 20% reduction of emissions. What people also don't tell you about that policy is that, of course, it's a great headline, and one should be suspicious about anything that makes a great headline as the basis for an energy policy. It is a great headline, but what they don't tell you is, while the emissions have gone down and we're on target for those emissions, we're increasing our carbon footprint, both in Europe and the United Kingdom. So for all the extra costs of energy, for all the blighting of the countryside, this country and the European Union is now contributing about 4% more of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So it is a counterproductive policy. That's because if you stop manufacturing effectively within Europe and you manufacture in India or China less efficiently, and then transport goes back. There is bound to be more carbon dioxide goes into the area. Final point on the follies, so I suspect my time's running out, but there's a lot to say on these issues. Liberian Capital have done an analysis of the capital markets just in this country, and their estimate to 2030 of the extra capital, not the capital itself, but the extra capital to pay for the renewables, for the difference between the replacement of like-for-like gas plants, coal plants, whatever sort of plants we are currently using to produce electricity, is approximately, and obviously it's an estimate, £220 billion, so close to £250 billion extra in terms of the estimated extra cost. When I put that to Lord Studham, who he thought that was a trivial figure to be paid. I'm sort of old enough to remember when £1 million was a lot of money. And £250 billion strikes me as a great deal of money indeed. I will come, so there is a great deal more I could say about the folio of our energy policy. But I will try and come to a conclusion. For holding these views, and a number of people across the political parties have looked at the facts and have tried to understand what's going on. Then words like climate skeptic, climate denier are used, and I think they're words that are often used to stop debate. They're used in European debate, and I think they come from a strong authoritarian and anti-democratic stream that is developing within our society. There is an impulse amongst many members of the, I don't like this word, but I can't think of another word just at the moment, of the political classes in this country, to want to be elected to something and then not take the decisions. They would like to hand over responsibility to a Congo, or hand over responsibility to business, or hand over responsibility to bureaucrats in Brussels, and then they cannot be responsible when things go wrong. And I think it is that impulse that says we can hand over our energy policy, crazy as it is to anybody who looks at it, to scientists. They know best. We won't look at that, and it's exactly the same kind of words that try to close down debate in the European debate. I've mentioned, not by name, I'll mention him by name now, because I think he exemplifies the point better than almost anybody I can think of. I try very hard, I'm pleased to be here on our next platform, to respect political opponents and listen to their arguments and trying to get to the right answer on behalf of people. Gregory Barker is the Conservative Energy Minister of State for Energy, but I think he does really exemplify what is wrong with it. On science and technology, so we were looking for an agreed definition of climate change, and we're out of one as it happens, but Gregory's definition was this: climate change is climate change. This was less than helpful. So I challenged him, could he be more helpful to the committee? And he said, well, climate is a changing climate. That's what it is. So, but this is a person who, when asked to defend the policy, says, well, it's the scientists, Margaret Thatcher was in favour of it, everybody agrees with it, the scientists all agree with it, so, and that's it. Now that is an abdication of responsibility of any elected representative in a ministerial position, not to understand what they're saying. He also said, and we had another row in the committee on the Energy and Climate Committee, that there were too many sceptical voices on the radio and the television about climate change, and they should be shut up. This comes back to the authoritarian point. When I asked him to name them, he refused point blank to name them. But again, I think it is an excellent example of the desire to shut up the opposition and not to get at the facts on this issue. So I think there are similar arguments, the arguments that are not arguments often put by Nick Clegg, that there are 3 million jobs going to be destroyed if we leave the European Union, while forgetting to mention that the euro is probably the biggest job-destroying machine that Europe has seen in the last 50 years. And it has been the case since the Enlightenment that those of us who believe in democracy try to look to the evidence to develop policies, and we look to people to determine who should govern us, not to scientists, bureaucrats, business people who are elected. So I will finish on this. I believe that evidence should be the basis of policy, and that in a slogan in a 19th century American election, when it was used against Ulysses S. Grant, it still strikes me as the best argument for dealing with the European Union. And the slogan used against Ulysses S. Grant was "throw the rascals out." And I think that is the basis of democracy, that at the end of the day you have to be able to throw the people who are making policy out, you have to be able to throw them out. And we can't do that in Europe, and increasingly we can't do that with the Quangoisation and the delegating of power from elected politicians. Thank you very much.
And prior to becoming a member of the European Parliament in 1999, held a number of senior management positions with international companies, both in this country and in the Far East. As a Conservative member of the European Parliament, Roger initially advocated the renegotiation of EU treaties, but since 2006 he has been a supporter of the Better Off Out campaign. In 2012, Roger ended his somewhat turbulent relationship with the Conservative Party and joined UKIP. Roger has recently opposed the government's legislation to introduce same-sex marriage and is a prominent climate change skeptic. He is the author of the Bruges Group publication Cool Thinking on Climate Change. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Roger Helmer.
Well, Barry, thank you for that introduction, and can I say good evening everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here in this distinguished building and with this distinguished panel on St. George's Day. What better day can we have to debate these issues? And now Graham has said that he likes to have a rational debate with his political opponents, and I'm in a different political party. But I have to say, Graham, I am finding very little in what you have said to disagree with at any point. And indeed, I'd like to pick up something you said. Science is about getting to the truth. Of course it is. And I'm sure you would agree with me that the scientific method involves creating hypotheses, going out into the field, doing experiments, observing real data in the real world, and testing those hypotheses. And if those hypotheses give rise to predictions which are fulfilled, then you haven't proved the hypothesis, but you have increasing confidence in it. If, on the other hand, that hypothesis gives rise to predictions which prove to be false, then you have falsified the hypothesis and you look for alternative hypotheses. That is known as the scientific method. Unfortunately, it is not the IPCC method. And let me tell you, the IPCC is presented to us as a scientific consensus. It is nothing of the sort. It is an advocacy group. That is what it is. It starts with a preconception, a prejudice of the answers it wants to come up with, and then it cherry picks information and data and tries to support its original conclusion. Now, I can say this with some confidence because over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, I've taken a deep interest in this subject, and I've been to America a number of times. I've met a significant number of people who have been authors on IPCC reports, and I can tell you there is no consensus, because those I have worked with and talked to fundamentally disagree with the conclusions. I would quote, for example, Professor Fred Singer of the University of Virginia, one of the most distinguished climatologists in America, and a splendid chap who is campaigning on these issues despite being even older than me. He came up with a good line. He said, "The IPCC accepts my corrections to its punctuation, but not to its science." I also know a chap called Paul Reiter, who is, or was, an IPCC author. He's from the Pasteur Institute in Paris. I actually rode from a Chicago conference to the Chicago airport with him in a taxi, so we had plenty of time to talk about these things. He asked for his name to be removed from a previous IPCC report because it directly contradicted the advice he had given as a lead author. He was told, well, he had been on the team and therefore his name had to be on the report. And he said, yes, but you haven't said what I said and I don't take any responsibility for it. Eventually he had to get lawyers to write to the IPCC before they would agree to remove his name from the report. You've also got other very distinguished people like Richard Lindzen of MIT, who is skeptical of the current theory of climate change, has been an author with the IPCC. So the idea that the IPCC represents a consensus is mistaken. Also the idea that it's a scientific panel. Large numbers of the people on the IPCC panel are not scientists at all. Many of them are scientists, but with qualifications in areas that do not bear on the issue of climate change. The chairman of the IPCC, Ravindra Pachauri, for example, is a railway engineer, and I'm sure he's an extremely fine railway engineer, but I don't see why that qualifies him to speak about climate. Many of the people on the panel turn out to be nothing more than zealots who work for green NGOs, and it turned out that many of the scientific peer-reviewed claims in the previous IPCC report were merely quotations from Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth literature and propaganda, and had no basis in science at all. That is what we are dealing with. And the thing is backed up by civil servants and governments who have all bought into a particular set of policies and do not wish to hear when things go wrong. And as we all know, in terms of testing hypotheses, if you go back 15 years, the IPCC was predicting a very clear and very sharp rise in global temperatures as CO2 levels rose. Well, surprise, surprise, CO2 levels have continued to rise. Unfortunately, the temperature has not. And Graham referred to the University of East Anglia as the repository of one of the main sets of temperature data. He has 3. I think I tend to work on there being 4, but either way. If you take the data from the main recognized, reputable, respectable institutes that measure mean global temperatures, you will find there has been no rise in temperature for 17 years. There has been no rise in temperature this century. I often stand in front of school audiences, and kids in what I used to call the sixth form, they call it something else now, kids of 16 and 17, and they've all heard about climate change. They've all been brainwashed for most of their educational lives. And when I say to them, there has been no global warming in your lifetime, they are astonished, and some of them don't believe it, but you can show them the data, and there it is. I also get very cross with the phrase that is constantly used, the pre-industrial temperature. The pre-industrial temperatures, but also the phrase pre-industrial CO2 levels. The pre-industrial period during which this Earth has existed extends to about 4.5 billion years. During those 4.5 billion years, there have been radical changes in temperature, in climate. We've had situations where the world has been largely covered in ice. We've had situations where the world has had no ice at all. And we have had higher temperatures than today. We have had lower temperatures than today. What's more, there is no correlation between CO2 and temperature. Today's temperature, about which we all panic, is 400 parts per million, which, if I've got my decimal point in the right place, CO2 levels is 0.04%. It is a tiny, harmless, invisible, non-toxic, trace gas in the atmosphere. It has been, during the course of Earth history, up to 10 or even more than 10 times higher than that. And interestingly, in some of the periods when CO2 levels were very much higher than they are today, many times, an order of magnitude greater than they are today, the Ordovician Ice Age was taking place and large parts of the Earth were covered in ice. And as you probably know, if you watch the film Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's famous film, and he showed the wonderful correlation over the last 600,000 years between CO2 levels and temperature, as though that proved the case. Well, he made a very strong case for a correlation between CO2 levels and temperature. What he didn't tell you was, if you look at the fine detail of that graph, what you find is that the peaks of CO2 occur 800 to 1,000 years after the temperature changes. And in science, one thing is absolutely certain, and that is that effects do not precede causes. If you have two things which are clearly correlated, the one that occurs first may well be, it's not proven, but it may well be the cause of the one that occurs second, but the one that occurs second cannot possibly be the cause of the one that occurs first. Now, I will admit to you, I agree with Graham that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and as Graham says, I don't think anybody seriously disagrees with that. Where we do disagree is the sensitivity of the climate to the CO2, and I certainly take the view, which is shared with Fred Singer, whom I mentioned earlier, that if there is any temperature signal based on CO2, it is lost in the noise of other factors. It is absolutely clear that the main driver of terrestrial climate is in fact the sun and other astronomical cycles. There are clear long-term natural climate cycles which are well understood over a period of about 1,000 years. They gave us the Minoan optimum, the Roman optimum, the medieval warm period, and are now apparently giving us a new 21st century climate optimum. And we should cheer, because all the evidence of human civilization is that civilizations do much better when it's warm than when it's cold. And I can tell you that rich Americans who have lived in New England and enjoyed frosty winters, when they retire, what do? They move to Florida, because the temperature on average is about 10 degrees warmer, and they rather like that. So we are looking at natural changes. There's also a shorter term cycle over a period of about 60 years, and that is why from roughly the time I was born at the end of the war until about 1970, we saw a flattening, indeed a cooling trend, and then we got both of the short cycle and the long cycle, both warming between about 1975 and about 1998, which is what caused all the panic. And now we're into the other phase of the short cycle, and guess what? Temperatures are not rising, and if anything, going down a little bit. But never mind, regardless of whether you believe that human activity in CO2 causes climate change, I would argue that the policies we are adopting at the moment have absolutely no effect on the environment and on the climate, but they do have a massive effect on our economy. And I don't usually include Britain with the rest of Europe, but since we're all in the European Union and we are all subject to the same lunatic, perverse climate and energy policies, I have to say it is damaging both Britain and Europe. So what is going on here? First of all, we're investing vast amounts of money in renewable energy, particularly wind farms. Wind farms do not deliver. They are intermittent. They require fossil fuel backup. The fossil fuel backup has to run intermittently. Obviously, if you're balancing out intermittent wind, you have to have intermittent fossil fuel operation. As anybody who's been involved in that sort of large-scale industry will know, the least efficient way to run a gas-fired power station is to keep ramping it up and ramping it down, and then keeping it on spinning reserve while you don't need it, and then ramping it up again. So good and economic. But solar PV is the one other than farmers' fields covered with ugly black units. What will we do then, though? What we will do is we will say, why did we invest billions and billions of pounds on technology which by then will be obsolete or obsolescent, and which will be grossly inefficient? we will say if only we'd spent a fraction of that money on technical development until we had something that was actually efficient and affordable and economic, and then invested our money in solar PV, we would have achieved a much better outcome. So renewables are not working. Now, the next thing is, we in Britain, we could turn the whole of our economy off, and the emissions we would save would be replaced by the growth in China's emissions in 12 months. So, we are a mere drop in the ocean. Even the European Union is only about 12% of global emissions. But having said that we're only 12% of global emissions, Graham mentioned briefly our carbon footprint. One of the reasons that we're only 12% of global emissions is because we are moving energy-intensive businesses offshore at an enormous rate. We've moved production to China for many, many of the things we consume. If you take the carbon footprint of the goods we import, then Europe is actually responsible for about 25% of global emissions. And by the way, we're not reducing them. We're reducing them in Europe, but we're moving them offshore. This is a process that is called carbon leakage in the sort of nomenclature they like to use in Brussels. And what it means is that large companies are simply moving to other jurisdictions, frequently with lower environmental standards. I'm told by people in the steel industry that you emit twice as much CO2 making a ton of steel in China as you would if you made the same ton of steel in Germany or Britain. So the result of our policy is that we have damaged investment and jobs and the economy here in Britain and in Europe, and we have increased global emissions. Was that smart or what? That is what we are doing at the moment. And if you are not yet convinced that the policies we have are spitting against the wind, I was going to use a slightly more vulgar comparison, but we do have ladies present, just bear in mind that in the global pipeline today, there are an estimated 1,200 new coal-fired power stations in planning or being built, including, by the way, a couple of dozen in Germany. Isn't that interesting? So emissions will go up for our lifetimes, whatever we do. Get used to it. That is what is going to happen. There is nothing we can do, and putting up wind farms across half the country will not have the effect that we apparently desire. We have a series of policies that are damaging economically, that simply cannot deliver in terms of reducing CO2, even if we thought that, maybe you do think, even if we thought that was a good thing for the environment, ain't going to happen. So we need to get used to the idea. But then let's get round to the economic issue and the damage that these policies are doing. If you look across the Atlantic to the USA, and Graham's already mentioned it, we have shale gas in the USA. I was in Pennsylvania about 3 months ago in the town of Mansfield, which I thought was rather sweet because Mansfield in Nottingham is on my patch, and I was up there last week. So we've got Mansfield in Nottingham, and we've got Mansfield in Pennsylvania. I went to look at shale gas operations there, and actually don't believe all the black propaganda you hear about shale gas. The people around where I was are delighted by the economic results of their new industry. They've got new businesses coming in, they've got new hotels being built, they've got house prices going up because of all the new workers and the new jobs. They are extremely happy with the shale gas industry. But they have cheap shale gas. They are onshoring. You know, all that production that America 20 years ago, 15 years ago was sending to China, now they're bringing it back. And they're enjoying what they're describing as an economic renaissance. China has cheap energy because it's building coal-fired power stations like they were going out of style. So what you've got is a little island, if you like, called Europe, which has virtually the highest energy prices in the world. Japan's got a problem as well, but Europe, compared to other major economic areas like the States and like Asia, is making itself hopelessly uneconomic. Now that is not just an obscure opinion from some climate skeptic think tank. In fact, that is the view of European industry. One of the biggest chemical companies, you may not know the name because they keep changing their names, but INEOS, which actually is the company that owns the Grangemouth plant that we heard so much about recently. Jim Ratcliffe is their man, and Jim Ratcliffe said, the chemicals industry in Europe will be extinct in 10 years unless we do something about energy prices. I think that was extremely clear. There's a German company called BASF, which I think is the largest or second largest chemical company in Germany. It has always invested more in Europe than anywhere else. This year it is investing more outside Europe than inside Europe, and it is saying it is obliged to move its investment offshore because of energy prices. Now, about 2.5 weeks ago, I was sitting in Brussels, and I better not mention the name, but one of the world's largest cement companies came to see me and had a chat, and they said, unless we do something about energy prices in Europe, we will not be able to make cement anymore in Europe. It's very cheap. Surprisingly, cement is very cheap stuff to ship around the world. A container ship full of cement, very, very cheap. So it would be much cheaper to make their cement in India and ship it here. And that is just madness. We are losing the jobs, we are losing the investment, and we are sending it abroad, as I say, to areas with lower environmental standards. Now, I would like to say that the work that I have done as UKIP's energy spokesman has convinced the European Commission. I think that might be a little overstating my influence. I think, in fact, what has happened is that these same companies that have come and talked to me about their energy concerns have, of course, gone and talked to the Commission, and they've made it very clear to the Commission that they will be moving out of Europe unless something is done. And I was surprised and delighted about 3 months ago when Günther Oettinger, I'm sure you all know about Günther Oettinger and discuss him over your cornflakes each morning. He is the Energy Commissioner for the European Union, and he has said that various industries, including chemicals, metals and glass, will move ashore unless we sort this problem out. And he said Europe can no longer afford to pursue an independent energy policy, an independent climate policy with nobody else following. And the day after, it sounded like a coordinated move to me, we had Antonio Tajani, the Italian Industry Commissioner, who used a wonderful phrase that I think is a very resonant phrase. He said, we are creating an industrial massacre in Europe. Now that's very strong language for a European Commissioner. And incidentally, other little straws in the wind, the Commission has threatened the British government with a state aid action under the treaties for giving too large subsidies to the wind farm industry, and is taking similar action against Germany over its investment in solar PV. Sorry, I missed a point I was going to make earlier, and I must just pop it in because it's worth it. Many of you will have heard about Bjorn Lomborg, who wrote a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist. Now, he pretty much accepts the IPCC position, and he accepts their sensitivity and their predictions about where temperature is going to go. But what he said was, okay, let's look at the 120, I think it is, billion US dollars which Germany has invested in solar PV. Let's calculate how much emissions we've saved, and then let's plug that into the IPCC model and see what effect it has on climate change. Bear in mind, accepting the IPCC theory, which some of us reject. And he calculated that by the end of this century, the German investment of 120 billion US dollars will have the effect of delaying the progress of climate change by as much as 37 hours. Now bear in mind that we haven't seen any global warming, any climate change for 17 years. You can imagine how much 37 hours is worth. So there is a change of mood. The good news is that the commissioners have sort of recognised it, and in their targets for 2030, they're a little bit more flexible, only a little bit more flexible than they might otherwise have been. The problem, of course, is that we've got European elections this year, but we also change over the Commission. So what we're going to have to do is re-educate a new college of commissioners who will all come in eager to burnish their green credentials, and we must get them with their heads around a little bit of realism. And as Graham very rightly said, we are not running out of fossil fuels. Shale gas, underground coal gasification, an enormous opportunity. There's a vast amount of coal which currently is inaccessible under the North Sea, but underground coal gasification could bring it to the surface. And beyond all those things, there are methane hydrates. I won't get into the detail of methane hydrates, but they promise fossil fuel energy for at least 100 years and probably much longer. And I tell you what, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The fossil fuel age will not end because we run out of fossil fuels. It will end when we get better technologies. We just don't have them yet. But I think we're starting to win this argument. I'd like you to have in your mind the image of a great dam with a huge wall of water behind it. And that dam looks as though it's absolutely permanent. You know, a bit like the USSR when it was there, and we all felt it was sort of permanent. But then suddenly the plates start to move and there are little bits of damage and the odd crack here and there, and it still looks big and solid, and then all of a sudden it gives way. And I think that's where we are in the climate debate. You know, it is clear that the IPCC paradigm not only is wrong, but is economically unsustainable. It has to go. And we may have Ed Davey, like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, but it ain't going to work. That dam is just about to fall. We are winning the argument, and we must keep making the case. Thank you very much.
Speaker is Christopher Chope, a Member of Parliament between 1979 and 1983, when he pioneered local government privatisation and achieved substantial reductions in council expenditure. He was the first council leader to do that effectively. In 1983, he gained the parliamentary seat of Southampton Itchy, and from 1987 to 1992 served as a junior minister in various government departments. In 1997, Christopher became the Member of Parliament for Christchurch, and in 2008 he was one of just 5 Conservative Members of Parliament who voted against Ed Miliband's climate change bill. In 2010, he was elected Joint Secretary of the 1922 Committee and played a leading role in preventing government ministers being members of that committee. Since that time, he's been a leading member in securing an in-out referendum. Ladies and gentlemen, we all owe a debt to Christopher Chope for his tremendous service over the last 30 years. And we welcome him tonight. Christopher.
Well, Barry, thank you very much indeed for those very generous words of introduction. And can I say what a pleasure it is to be here this evening. I know we are planning to have a discussion between 8 and 8:30, so I'm going to keep my remarks reasonably brief, because I don't think there's much we disagree about. We agree that current energy policy is absolutely barking, and that there's a really unhealthy consensus across the mainstream political parties and in Westminster. And the 3 of us on the platform tonight from Parliament, 2 from Westminster, 1 from the European Parliament, we are a relatively small band of people who are, I think, actually in tune with public opinion on these issues. And which takes me back to some of you may remember the 1993 Christchurch by-election, when Robert Adley died, and there was a very strong Liberal challenge in the by-election, which was held a couple of months after that. And the biggest issue in the by-election was value-added tax on fuel, which had just been introduced by the major government as being a really good means of encouraging people to be more economical in their use of energy. And that policy went down on the doorstep like a lead balloon, I can assure you. And I can remember going out, knocking on doors, and people who go up the country drives, and they got 3 or 4 cars outside the front door, and you'd be saying that you were concerned that they were arguing against VAT on fuel, and they'd say, well, we don't want to push up the price of energy. And you'd look at them and say, well, that's not going to be a problem for you, is it? And they said, no, but we're very concerned about the lady down the road. What that by-election taught me was that actually the price of energy is highly politically sensitive. And we've seen a bit of it more recently in response to the cost of living campaign by the Labour Party. The government has had to act to try and deal with the cost of electricity prices. And they've been fiddling with figures, but effectively one way in which they're able to ensure that the electricity prices are not going up as much as they would have done otherwise is by transferring some of the subsidy which goes into energy direct from the consumers at the moment. In other words, it's added to the consumer's bill, and putting that bill onto the cost of the general taxpayer. And it's a sort of smoke and mirrors exercise. But that's because increasingly people have said, well, why do we have to pay all this extra for our energy when it's going into subsidising technologies which we disapprove of? As Graham said earlier, we're industrialising our countryside, but not just our countryside. I mean, in Christchurch Bay, for example, there's a proposal to put in one of the largest offshore wind farms ever. And we're talking there of 194 turbines, 194 turbines of 5 megawatts each, covering an area of 155 square kilometres. And each of those turbines is going to be 200 metres high, well over 600 feet. People used to go to Beachy Head, 600 feet above sea level. You can see the White Cliffs of Dover from across the channel. They're not 200 metres high. And so that's the sort of size we're talking about, really high and a major impact upon the landscape. And I've been campaigning on behalf of my constituents on this issue. And what has become clear is that the promoters of this, who are foreign-owned energy companies, that they are pretty fast and loose in the way that they deal with the facts. And Graham was saying at the very beginning how the government and the climate change scientists, so-called, try to use words in a very careful way to give an impression which is contrary to the truth. I'm just going to give you an extract from the response that I received from the project director for what's called Navitus Bay. Doesn't it sound charming? Just like somewhere in the West Indies. Navitus Bay is the name of which is given to this proposed wind farm. And it says here, finally, this is an answer to my question, my letter, you state that the wind park will be funded by contributions from domestic electricity customers. I want to stress that the construction of the project will be financed wholly privately. However, should planning permission be granted, we will most likely apply to the government for a contract for difference prior to commencing construction. This is a support mechanism, it's described. He's not even prepared to concede that it's a subsidy. And that's the way they're sort of trying to delude people into believing that there is no cost associated with this. Of course, all that energy generated, if it ever gets built, and I hope it won't, but all that energy will be subsidised to the extent of about 3 times what the cost of ordinary gas is. So the money would be going into that subsidy, apart from going on to people's electricity bills, is money that could be spent in some other way, either reducing the deficit, or it could be used in adaptation measures. I mean, I think we were sensible as a country to recognise the changes in the weather and the risks associated with North Sea surges and build the Thames Barrier, just as well we did. I mean, from experience last winter. In Christchurch, there was some very serious flooding about 20 years ago, and they built, under the Thatcher government, we built flood defences. And I'm pleased to say that in the most recent winter, those flood defences prevented almost everybody in Christchurch from having a flood experience. And one of the worst cases we had was actually of a small block of flats where the then owners of those flats said they didn't want to have the flood defences because it would spoil the view of the river. Subsequently, people have said, well, they wish that hadn't been said. But much better to invest in adaptation rather than invest in these ludicrous subsidies to these foreign-owned companies. And let's remember that these wind turbines, apart from being very unsightly, they didn't last forever. They've got a maximum useful life of 25 years, probably less than that. And then they have to be taken down. So you've got the cost of constructing them offshore, and then you've also obviously got the task of decommissioning them. So the question I'm going to throw out for your discussion is because there is so much consensus amongst us here in this room about this, what can politicians do to change the nature of this debate? Because if everybody thinks that our energy policy, which is of putting up the cost of energy and industrialising our countryside and our seascape, is mad, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to, each within our own political parties, and engage with the public, and particularly probably the broadcasting companies, and the BBC in particular, to try and get the facts across so that there can be, in a sense, a popular revolution, as indeed there was in the Christchurch by-election. Because what happened in the Christchurch by-election? A Conservative majority of over 23,000 the previous year was converted into a majority of some 17,000 for the Liberal Democrats, just in the course of the by-election. Largely falls on the issue of the cost of energy and VAT on fuel. And in a recent debate about VAT, about energy prices, I put to the Energy Secretary that we should actually abolish the remaining VAT on fuel, 5%. Of course you can't do it. You can't do it because of European Union law. But again, ludicrous. Why should we be taxing something which is actually an essential commodity and is contributing to what's called, the high costs are contributing to what's called fuel poverty? Basic energy is essential in our country, and it's needed by both consumers but also by industry. So what I hope we can answer at the end of tonight's discussion is what can we do to change the policy? We've got people like Graham String on select committees. My good friend Peter Lilly is now on a select committee carrying forward the torch which he lit when the so-called Climate Change 5 voted against the climate change legislation in 2008. But I tell you, in that, just to indicate how strongly the consensus was against us, one of my colleagues who was amongst those five was told by the leader of the Conservative Party, who was then the leader of the opposition, he was told that as a result of voting against, one of five voting against the rest of the whole Parliament, that he had effectively deprived himself of ever getting a front bench position or a ministerial job from the Prime Minister. And I think that it is that sort of intolerance which is unacceptable. And we need, in a healthy democracy, in a healthy Parliament, we need to encourage people to ask the questions, the sorts of questions that Graham and others are asking. So concluding, let's see if we can come up with the way in which we're going to be able to push this up the agenda in these. The Prime Minister today reported as being rather minded to do something about it, and we'll have to wait and see what that turns out to be in terms of policy. But we need to have much more of a popular revolution on this, otherwise we're going to be landed with a continuing energy policy which just doesn't add up in terms of either economics or the environment.